Hey everyone, I'm Humaira Ghilzai. I am an Afghanistan cultural advisor. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Laura Tedesco, who I'm going to just call Laura John going forward. She is the star of a podcast called Monuments Woman. But for her real credentials, I'd like to allow her to introduce herself. So, hi, Laura. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, Humaira John. How are you?
I'm well. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to see you.
Yeah, same here. Same here. Tell me your current role and your title.
My current role, and has my role also for the last 12 years, is I am Cultural Heritage Program Manager for the State Department's Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. So it's a geographic region that's limited to South and Central Asia that my work focuses on.
I'm so glad I asked you to do that. I'm sure I would have left one of those geographical references out. So you and I met, I believe it was April of 2011.
That sounds right. Yep.
Yeah, and in Afghanistan. And I don't know if I've told you this, but I'll tell you now again, that when I first saw you, I was like, who is this beautiful, cool woman? And what is she doing in Kabul? And she's a doctor, like, what the heck? So I was on a State Department trip and you were one of our hosts.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was a really, really good time. That was like you had been in Afghanistan for less than a year, right?
Less than a year. Yeah, but it felt like dog years. Like less than a year really felt like several years.
Yeah, so you were, when you got hired at the State Department, that's what you did. You went to Afghanistan.
Within 2 weeks of getting hired. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Do you want to just like tell us a little bit about like what you're were chartered with, at least when you were offered the job, maybe not when you actually got there?
Yeah, well, when I was offered the job, it was to work at the US Embassy in Kabul for, they said, we'd only need you for 1 year, then that will be enough. And it was to sort of help identify new cultural preservation projects in Afghanistan that the US Embassy could support. And when I arrived in Kabul, the job really evolved to be quite a bit more, and and just a little bit different, but in a good way, different in a good way.
So yeah, so you basically just got dropped in this very giant ocean where it's like, go ahead, swim to shore. Well, I do have to say, when I was there, I was really impressed by how you moved very seamlessly between the diplomats and Afghans and military and all of us who were on this trip, supposedly dignitary. Was that something you had to like build the skills for once you got there, to be 1 minute dealing with the ambassador, another one, like, you're in the Ghazni, by Balai Sad and talking to Afghan elders? I mean, that's a big breadth of cultural diplomacy. Yeah, walk me through like what happened when you got there, and what did you have to like absorb in order to sort of grow into your role, just as in like the personal parts of it?
Yeah, I think the steepest learning curve for me was learning the protocols of the State Department and how to interact with my colleagues in the State Department, and sort of expectations of behavior, and also general rules of how to, like, hierarchies of how the diplomatic corps is structured. And that took me quite a while to kind of glean. And so, like, here's an example. Once I was driving in a car with one of our ambassadors, and we were going to make a visit to the National Museum. And there's a driver and another person in the front seat. So nobody sits in the front seat except for like the driver and his security companion. And the back seat is available for the 2 passengers. And I jumped in the back seat behind the passenger in the front seat. And I was quickly informed, you cannot sit there. That is only where the ambassador sits.
Oh.
So that was sort of, and that's like a rule. And so, or it was a rule in that particular instance. So while that's not so much interacting, it just is an example of how there were a lot of things that I had to learn. With respect to interacting, say, with Afghan elders or, an unusual governor of a province, say, you remember our meeting, the governor of Ghazni, or military, that felt more natural to me. And it really just comes down to, I think, an ethos of how one interacts with people, with an openness, with a, general politeness, a sort of a sensitivity that everybody's coming from their own place, and try to meet them somewhere in the middle. And so that was less difficult than learning how to interact with my diplomatic colleagues at the US Embassy.
So there was nothing in the employee handbook that told you don't sit in this seat if you're in the same car as the ambassador.
I don't remember reading that. Maybe it was a footnote, but I don't remember that one.
Skip that page. I bet you did. You just seem like that kind of person that will skip a page and go to the next. Well, that is something that I have to say I noticed about you. You were very there's a Dari word for it called sangeen, which if you were to translate it, it means like a stone, like a stone. I knew you would like it, but not in your physical capacity, but your mannerism is in a way very Afghan, because you're very like you don't make big gestures like I'm doing right now. And you're very calm, and you think about what you're saying, and you don't laugh and act crazy like some Americans are, stereotyped to do. So there's like when a groom comes to a bride's house, for to ask for her hand, like the first thing, if the parents say is like, he's sangeen, that's great, because he's going to be a very thoughtful, kind, son-in-law that's going to pay attention. So I'm not surprised that you were successful with the Afghans.
That's good to hear. Sangeen, I'll have to remember that.
Even with our very interesting governors, I'm sure there are very, memorable meetings. That kind of takes me to my next question, because in one of the podcast episodes, you talked about how when you would go to a cultural heritage site, sometimes you would talk to the people who are like milling about or living near it, and you indicated that were mostly men. But what did you talk to them about? Like, did they ask you questions? Did you ask them questions? And what kind of insight did you get about their relationship to the cultural heritage sites?
Yeah, so they often did not ask me questions. And it was mostly men who I would see when I would visit sites or towns. And so if I had an opportunity through an interpreter, I would ask, I always had the question to ask an elder, sort of an open-ended question. What did they think about this site that we were here to see? And then see what sort of answer would come, which would then be an indication to me of what kind of significance the site had for this elder who I took to represent a village. Like, an elder's voice is respected and considered knowledgeable, of course, and could be representative of a general view of something. So I'm thinking particularly of a visit that I made to Panjshir and to scout sites there that could perhaps be restored, or where some kind of preservation activities could take place. And Panjshir at that time was fairly permissive, so we could move around, and I could interact with Panjshiris with whom we encountered. And on 2 occasions in Panjshir, in the week or so that I spent there, on 2 occasions, 2 different elders referred to the monuments and the small archaeological sites that we were looking at as having been built by Alexander the Great. And while I thought historically that may not have been accurate, that was less important, whether historically that was factual or not factual. What that indicated to me was that they're attributing the site to someone historically significant, very important, internationally known. So they themselves regarded the site as that important. Alexander the Great had been there, and he himself had built that place.
Wow. Well, that was very thoughtful of you not to correct him and set the record straight.
No.
He did not come to Panjshir. I am kind of jealous. I would have loved to go to Panjshir. I bet you it's really beautiful.
It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And if only people could experience the beauty of Panjshir. I mean, it's at the time of year I was there, it's green. Go ahead.
It's green and rolling hill. Like, that's what I imagine it, but I don't know.
Well, I was there in sort of late spring, early summer. So that time of year, there had been some spring rain. So the pastures, everything just seemed so green, and their valleys were very green. And we had these enormous picnics with all the elders would come together. And I was one of maybe 100 enjoying these massive picnics in these beautiful valleys, and, sort of rushing streams of water going through the center of villages with little wooden footbridges built over them. And just really, really beautiful.
Oh my goodness, sounds gorgeous. Oh, well, it's interesting that we've kind of went in here, and this wasn't even like an area I wanted to take the interview, but a lot of times people ask me, oh, is Afghanistan like a desert? Because pretty much every clip and picture and whatever we see is like mountains, dust, lots of dust. But it's got such a diverse terrain, and that's pretty incredible that you've experienced that. I've sort of just been to the Kabul, Ghazni, Jalalabad area. So maybe one day I'll get to go back.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. But yeah, Panjshir is, some people think it's Panjshir, which it means 5 milk, but it's Panjshir is 5 lions. So it's just with like one little change in pronunciation, you can completely change the image of a place. Which is kind of a good segue to my next question, which is, are there some common threads between Afghan cultural heritage sites as opposed to, let's say, Pakistan and Syria or other places that you've worked? Like, for example, do you see some commonality with like the Ghazni Minarets, Musaynak, and the Herat Citadel? Or is this like a completely dumb question to be asked?
No, it's not a dumb question at all. So common threads that I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking common threads that unite Afghan sites
Exactly.
specifically.
Yeah.
I see. I have to think about that. Not that come to mind right away. What unites them is what's so different about them.
Oh, okay.
That's sort of but that's what comes to mind and by different, I mean just the diversity among sites. And Pakistan is similar with its diversity of sites, and as many countries are, but Afghanistan, just sort of the range of diversity is really remarkable.
So by diversity, do you mean like when they were built, or the messages, or their usage, or what? Like, give us an example of that.
Right. So the range of when they were built, the sort of thousands of years that you can traverse the Afghan landscape and come across sites and monuments that represent thousands of years of history. And each of those sites, let's talk, since we were in Ghazni together, and the minarets that we visited. So they're about 1,000 years old, roughly. And also adjacent to the minarets in Ghazni is the other site, Tepe Sardar, where I think we went together. It's a Buddhist site. And that's about 1,500 years old.
Wow, okay.
For example. And then while we didn't really have time to do this together during our visit, then there are other archaeological sites within the vicinity of Ghazni city, which are several thousand years old.
Wow.
So within the span of, say, 10 square kilometers, you have evidence of thousands of years of history.
I didn't realize that there was the 500-year difference between the Minaret and the Tepe Sardar. And I'm sure you educated us, but I was so excited to be there. I'm sure I didn't retain anything. Which brings me to, like, let's say if you are a 20-something Afghan American, and you want to learn about Afghanistan's cultural heritage site, what after you listen to Monuments Woman and you learn, where should be the next thing? Is there like some books you would recommend, or maybe like one or two sites that you would recommend that for them to research? Like, what would be kind of Dr. Laura Tedesco's recommendation?
I think the book that I go to again and again on Afghanistan's heritage is Nancy Dupree's book. She wrote it really as a guide, like almost a guide for tourists, but it's very detailed. And she wrote it in 1970, when Afghanistan was a rather different country than it is today. And she updated it in 1977.
Wow.
But it's her breadth of knowledge, and she drove really the entire country and documented sites, and she knew the history already very well. So she was able to put the sites into a context and also give really wonderful references in Nancy's book to, if you visit this site, for example, in Zabul, in Kalat, the capital of Zabul, which is a province we talk about in the podcast, you could get a cup of tea at this little tea house, and you could stay in this hotel, but don't stay in the other hotel because it's not so clean. Or, also these little tips that were very...
Nancy would do, as if she's just giving you recommendations.
Right. And, sort of which merchant to visit in the bazaar and things like of this. So it gives you a little glimpse of some of Nancy's personality, but also excellent historically accurate information and a kind of taste of what it would have been like to travel around Afghanistan in that time. So for someone who wanted to learn about Afghanistan's heritage, I would say start with Nancy Dupree's book. I think it can be found on Amazon, or
Okay.
it's a little bit hard to find. Like, there aren't lots of copies of it floating around, but they're out there. And
the million people who watch our show, our interview,
yeah,
I'm sure it'll be out of stock very quickly.
yes, it's a collector's item.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can also start a business where you just copy the pages and all like staple them together and we'll put it on Amazon. Well, Nancy Dupree was like considered like the mother of Afghanistan, right?
I think she evolved into be the grandmother eventually, because
Okay.
she lived so long. But yeah, I mean, she really devoted her career to Afghanistan, many facets, but its history, its heritage, literacy efforts. She established her library at Kabul University, but she would not call it her library. She would say, "No, it doesn't belong to me. It's the Afghans' library." So yeah, she was very well known.
Yeah, what an incredible woman. We won't go too much deeper into it, but if anybody is interested in learning about her, she had a very fascinating life. And so Google her.